Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure. It's a particular pleasure to talk about the book. So let me first sort of give you some ideas how this book came to
I
be.
hold it up so everybody can see that it really exists here.
So actually, this is the sort of pre-publication version.
An
And
insider's
that,
look.
and that is, I like to mark my books up, and I just can't do that to the real book. So I brought this along. So this is the book. Sarah's already told you about it. So the way the book came to be, and actually I dedicated the book to Professor John Lewis, who's no longer with us. But he is the guy that was responsible for me going to North Korea in 2004 in January. That was my first of 7 visits. And what I wanted to capture in the book is, to some extent, is to give people an idea of what North Korea is like, of what the North Koreans are like, their nuclear complex, their diplomats. Because of that introduction from John to North Korea, I did have remarkable access to both their technical facilities, even more important, their technical people, and then the diplomats. And so that's what I try to capture in the book in great detail. And so actually my hope was to, as you read the book, actually make you feel like you're there with me. And we had enough detail because both John and I were very good note takers, particularly John was. So that was then one of the reasons for doing the book. The second aspect is because of my technical background, having spent 34 years at Los Alamos National Laboratory, I actually followed that with 17 years at Stanford. And so because of my technical background and having worked with plutonium, having worked in the nuclear arena, and the access that they gave me was just, it was so remarkable. But it wasn't just the technical world, because of people like John Lewis and his colleagues, Bob Carlin, Jack Pritchard, and many others. I also got to see what the diplomatic world was like in North Korea. And then what I became convinced is from the fact that essentially through my visits from 2004 to 2010, and then subsequent to the visits and continuing to analyze what's going on in North Korea, is what I did was to try to integrate and link together the technical and the political or diplomatic aspects. And as I did that over the years, what really occurred to me is that the way that our government was approaching and reacting to this problem of having a nuclear North Korea was just not sufficiently informed from the technical side. And so I wanted to write the book to lay that out because as I then went through both my visits and the years afterwards, I became convinced that North Korea had what I call, and I try to develop that in here, a dual track strategy for dealing with the United States, particularly. The dual track being that diplomacy on one hand, and the fact that they seriously pursued diplomacy. But at the same time, it was plus the nuclear development. And so it wasn't whether it was diplomacy or nuclear development, it was both. And so over the years that I've watched them, myself now since 2004, but then also going back to essentially 1990, understanding what happened there through John Lewis, Bob Carlin, and others, and now forward to 2022, I'm convinced that it was always both, not one or the other. Now, which one would be prioritized sort of depended on their situation vis-a-vis the United States. It depended on their domestic situation. It depended on their nuclear advancement. So all of those things, they would go one or the other. But what one had to appreciate is that both of those paths they were pursuing. And then particularly, what's very different from what my belief is of what I've concluded, different from what at least the last three American administrations before Biden did, and that is the Bush administration, Obama administration, the Trump administration. They really believed that North Korea was never seriously interested in diplomacy, that diplomacy was essentially just for the sake of buying time or building up their nuclear program. And that, I maintain and try to develop in here is an error. And then, so as time went on through these three administrations, as the North Koreans made nuclear advances, then that led to what I call the hinge points, the name of the book. So in other words, decision points. And at those decision points, then the American government essentially viewed those, you can't trust the North Koreans. They lie, they cheat. There isn't a single agreement that they've actually held. And so at these hinge points, then you have to make decisions. And essentially bad decisions lead to bad consequences. And that's what happens. And that's what I try to track in here. And so let me say a little bit more as to why do I believe that the North Koreans were actually serious about diplomacy. And this actually, we had, John Lewis and I had our beliefs, but it was really brought home through my interactions here with the CNS and with Professor Zachary Shore and the book of A Sense of Your Enemy. And essentially what Zachary Shore says is that, look, you follow the patterns of what countries do and how they work with each other. But he said what's really important is the pattern breaks. He said, so if you study pattern breaks or the pattern changes, that gives you some insight as to what the drivers are for the other country and what the constraints may be. And so Bob Cowlin and I have been working on a project with Sarah and other colleagues here, and we're doing the North Korea piece to put those together. And it turns out that the big pattern break was around 1990 timeframe. And in 1990 timeframe, as you all know, so we're getting very close to the end of the Cold War. And of course, lots of things, our focus was over in Soviet Union, Russia dissolving and so forth. But these were really difficult and new times for North Korea because, their benefactors were China and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union fell apart and China turned towards South Korea, for economic and other reasons. So all of a sudden, China recognized South Korea. Soviet Union fell apart. Russia and Yeltsin had no use for North Korea. And so Kim Il-sung, as we now call him the grandfather, looked at all of that. And the pattern break was from all those years of essentially the establishment of North Korea through the Korean War and through after the Korean War, it was antagonism between the U.S. and North Korea, of course, antagonism between the South and the North as well. And Kim Il-sung at that point actually decided that perhaps a better path for them, for North Korea, is to seek strategic accommodation with the United States or normalization of relations with the United States. And for that, you have to do serious diplomacy. You're not just doing diplomacy to buy time or to do whatever. You have to do serious diplomacy. But they also, just because of the nature of the Koreans, and I think it's probably whether you're North or South, doesn't matter, because of the nature and because of the specifics of what they faced in the late 1980s, essentially things started to fall apart. And the North Koreans did not like to deal from a position of weakness. They liked to deal from a position of strength. Well, strength was pretty hard to come by, by 1990 or so time frame. And so the potential for the strength came from the nuclear development. And so that's what then pushed the nuclear development, and the diplomatic development was to say, can we actually get there with the United States? And so that's what I track here, as I then watched them go from that time that they said diplomacy now, might actually be in our favor. And so I watch that as we go through. And so let me just sort of briefly mention the hinge points, and then Sarah and you can, dig in more detail. So the first big hinge point actually occurs in the Bush administration, because what happened after Kim Il-sung decided to actually have this look at a strategic accommodation with the United States. And first, a little detour. It turns out, for those of you who knew John Lewis, he was a remarkable individual, just remarkable individual. John actually had something to do with that pattern break, in that he invited North Koreans to come out here to the Bay Area to meet with Bill Perry. That was before Bill Perry was actually Secretary of Defense. And that was sort of the beginning of the opening up. And then the Americans finally had a meeting with the North Koreans in New York, namely Arnie Cantor, who some of you knew. So that sort of opened things up. And between that time, sort of late 1990, then going into 1994, and these are long, long stories I won't go through, but in 1994, the United States, Clinton administration, and the North Korea, signed an agreed framework. It actually wasn't an agreement because the Americans wanted to do in such a fashion they didn't have to get a lot of approval, from Congress to do this, so they called it a framework. And so, nevertheless, it was a nuclear deal. And again, it's a long story. It's the ups and downs of that nuclear deal. But when the Clinton administration goes out, the Bush administration comes in. There was much of the leadership in the Bush administration really believed the fact that the North Koreans simply cannot be trusted. In fact, that North Korea shouldn't even exist. And so they were determined to kill this bad deal the Clinton administration made. And they did. And again, I won't go into details here, except let me just say the consequences of that were horrendous. They were just horrendous. And so the reason, what gave them a reason and sort of an excuse to kill the deal, that whereas the North Koreans had agreed to shut down their nuclear plutonium complex in this place called Yongbyon. And it turns out they did that. And in fact, and again, I can talk about this later, and we're developing this as part of the strategic empathy, pattern break thing, is the decisions that the North Koreans made in 1994, and then how they played that going forward in the plutonium complex, have haunted them to this day. They have never, ever caught up. And that's not fully appreciated. Because you see the missiles going off again in the last couple of days again. You see the missiles and you say, these North Koreans are just going to town. Well, guess what? They don't have much plutonium. They're stuck today with somewhere around 50 kilograms of plutonium. It depends whether they actually did reprocess recently or not. 50 kilograms. The reactors they gave up had the potential of making 300 kilograms a year. And now what they have in their inventory is 50 or so. And the reactors you also need to make tritium. They have very little tritium, maybe for a few hydrogen-like bombs. That's essentially never hits the news anywhere. They have this enormous limitation. I don't quite understand why they haven't tried to fix that. One of the reasons is, of course, they've gone to highly enriched uranium. But that's a second-rate bomb fuel as far as I'm concerned, coming from Los Alamos. Why mess with highly enriched uranium? I mean, you need it for some reasons, but the world's arsenals are built around plutonium. And so at any rate, it turns out the Bush administration did kill the agreed framework. They walked away because North Korea was presumably pursuing uranium enrichment and centrifuges. Well, it turns out they were. This is part of this dual strategy. They stopped the plutonium, they hedged with the uranium. And so should one have called them up and say, hey, wait a minute, this doing the uranium? Yes, indeed. Should one have walked away and given them license to go and reprocess the plutonium, build the bomb? Heavens no, that's a poor technical decision. And if you look at the consequences, they speak for themselves. And we still have people, former from the Bush administration, who still claim that they did absolutely the right thing. And in here, I try to really bring out, say that's just not so. But this isn't just a Republican problem or a Bush problem. Obama had a similar problem for different reasons, but also President Obama himself and his people also believed that in the end, the North Koreans are just after provocation, extortion, and then wanting a reward. And so I traced the Obama all 8 years and just say, it's just too bad. Their hinge points were essentially when the North Koreans, which was also, by the way, several of these things, this wasn't just all the United States. The North Koreans did some things where you say, why in the world would they do this? So President Obama came in 2009, and they go ahead and greeted him with a rocket launch. So that was sort of the wrong way, to develop a friendship with the guy who said, I will, reach out my hand if you unclench your fist. So what he got instead is the fist right in his eyes. And then in 2012, when they finally came around to try to make a deal after recovering from this problem with the rocket launch, then again, the North Koreans went ahead and launched a rocket again to try to launch a satellite. By the way, both of those failed in 2009 and 2012. And that really did it for Obama. And I track it in here. So the rest of the Obama administration did just was not much into play. And then comes Trump. Trump actually does reach out, through the Singapore summit. And then the big hinge point is the Hanoi summit. And I've talked about it here before in some detail. In essence, the Hanoi summit, North Koreans were willing to make a deal, but they wanted some sanction relief in return for giving up the Yongbyon facility. And most of the Washington establishment, in this case, both Democrat and Republican, said, boy, Trump was right to walk away. They just weren't giving enough. And I was here and I gave a talk on that, shortly. And I said, no, right after. And I said, this was wrong. It was the wrong thing to do. Because again, if you look technically, what we would have gained by getting back into Yongbyon, what we would have gained by shutting down the plutonium program once again, was worth the risk. And in all of these cases, the administration, whether it was any of those three, they were trying to push the risk towards zero instead of saying, let's analyze the risk and then let's go ahead and manage that risk. And they didn't do that. And I said, within a few weeks of the Hanoi summit, this is just a major mistake. And so was it? Well, if we look at the situation today, again, you have to look at the end results. I mean, what happened is they've really gone to town. And now, in addition to everything else, they're not answering the phone. Because it's not only the technical gains that they've made in their missile program particularly, but it's also the political gain. And so this may be another pattern break, where perhaps for the first time in these 30 years, that the North Koreans now are no longer interested in strategic accommodation with the United States, that it's over. And so that sounds pretty bad. What I say in the epilogue, which was written a year ago or so, but be prepared, because you never know about the North Koreans. In the end, they're pragmatic. And depends how the world develops as to whether something will change. But so the book then develops all of these things, goes into hinge points, goes into details, and I want to encourage you, if you want to understand North Korea and the nuclear, you got to read the book, and that's why I put such an incredible amount of detail in the book, is because it gives you sort of this inside view. And Sarah has read it, so I'm going to turn to her.
Well, thank you so much, Sig. The book is incredible, but it's always so good to have you telling the stories. So I'm delighted that we get to have a little bit of both here. As I mentioned at the outset, what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Sig some questions to tease out some of these themes that he's kind of put on the table for us here in these first 20 minutes or so. But I really want all of you to be thinking about your own questions as well. So I'm going to give you a preview of some of the major themes I'm going to ask about so you can start to put your thinking caps on. Sig and I had a short conversation about this in his office this morning, so I'm eager to hear kind of more about the DPRK's relationship with China and also with Russia and the USSR. And you sort of hinted at some of this in your remarks, but I'd love to draw you out on this a bit more. I was also really interested in the book to hear about how North Korea kind of communicates its technical advances to outside audiences. And it sounds like there's been kind of a transition there from when you were visiting in person to sort of now when they're doing these tests and all that sort of thing. So I'd love to ask you some of that as well. One thing I'm curious to hear about that I know very little about because it's not within my area of expertise, but North Korea's nuclear exports. I'd love to talk to you more about that and kind of understand what they were hoping to do through those. To step back a little bit and think about the approach you took to writing this book. This is obviously a technical book and you are a technical expert, but you're writing for an audience of people like myself who do not consider themselves to be technical experts. So I'm wondering sort of what it was like doing that for a broad audience and what you think some of the most important technical details are for an audience to understand to really get the story that you're telling. And then, the last couple of questions, I'd love to know more about the human dimension to your story. So you have spent this time in North Korea, you've interacted with North Koreans. What do we gain from that sort of on the ground knowledge that is not accessible to us when we're looking at satellite imagery and ground imagery, things like that? And then finally, I want to come back to some of the earlier points you made about, this approach we've been using in our strategic empathy project of looking for pattern breaks to understand how people can identify when they are in the midst of a pattern break or in the midst of an inflection point to make better policy decisions. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about here. And I'm going to sort of launch right in here, if that's all right with you, Sig, with having put all of this on the table. So you make the case in your book, and I was very interested to learn this myself as someone who works on Russia, that neither the USSR nor China really supported the DPRK's quest for nuclear weapons. It's a different side of the street where we're talking about delivery systems, but with respect to their nuclear program, they weren't very supportive. But as you also described, there was this close relationship between the USSR and the DPRK in sort of the civilian nuclear technology side of the street. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about how Moscow's approach to the DPRK and its pursuit of nuclear weapons evolved over time, and maybe the same thing for China as well. And I was particularly struck in reading by the fact that, for instance, the USSR really didn't want to support the DPRK's quest for a light water reactor until they joined the NPT. So I'm hoping you can kind of help us understand what the significance of that was.
Wow. How's that for a question?
Just take us through the whole history.
Well, Sarah, thank you. Those will be fascinating topics of discussion, and I could speak now for another hour. To answer
I hope
these.
you do.
No. So you come. So I'll do it piecewise,
Great.
and then you can take it from there. So let me start with the Russia relationship with North Korea in nuclear things. Again, I'll try to make it as short as possible. People have questions, by all means, jump in. So this is now Soviet time. So Soviet Union works very early on, from the early 1950s, with the DPRK on general nuclear things, education of people. But then particularly after the Atoms for Peace, President Eisenhower gave a speech in December of 1953 about Atoms for Peace. Soviets were a little slow to pick up because they thought it was an American trick. But then they decided they would do it. And I think I've said this here before at CNS, do a peaceful atom program like Atoms for Peace. So in other words, they then went and helped to educate the North Koreans in nuclear-related technologies and nuclear physics, and build them the first facilities for nuclear research, on the way potentially for nuclear electricity. And that first reactor, the so-called IRT 2000 reactor, which by the way, the Soviets put into lots of their Eastern Bloc countries because their peaceful atom program was going to do something similar to what the United States was doing with its country. So about the same time that the Soviets helped the North Koreans build that first research reactor, we put one into Iran. And of course, we educated the Iranian nuclear scientists here in the United States. So this was all part of the Atoms for Peace program. That's how Yongbyon was initially constructed, moved in that direction, all very much on the up and up in terms of supporting peaceful nuclear energy. So that's how it started. The North Koreans, however, and the North Koreans actually at various points also turned to the Russians and say, "Hey, look, we need the bomb. Could you give us the bombs?" And particularly, various things that happened during the Korean War and afterwards. And the Soviets said, "No, you can't have the bomb." And so they then started, again, in the spirit of sort of this dual track in those years of 70s, 80s, and first into the 90s was nuclear for both civilian and for military. So the Soviets were supporting the civilian, and then the North Koreans were building their own military capacity. And the way that they did that was to go, instead of the light water reactors, to these gas graphite reactor or graphite moderated reactors, which it turns out they're not very good for making electricity. There are none left in the world that are really making electricity, although the French and the Brits, started out that way. They're not very good for electricity, but they're good for bombs. And so that's what they started to build in the 1980s. And their first reasonably small reactor, we call it the 5 megawatt electric reactor, went operational in 1986. And that's still today essentially the only reactor that's made any significant amount of plutonium. And they did this without Soviet help. That reactor was patterned after the so-called Calder Hall reactor in the United Kingdom. So they did not have help from the Russians. And then in terms of reprocessing, since you have to reprocess the spent fuel in order to make plutonium for bombs, they patterned that after a reprocessing facility in Belgium. That reprocessing facility was built for a civilian reactor reprocessing. So that's what they were doing into the 80s. But then by that time, they also recognized already that the Brits and the French are getting away from gas graphite reactors to try to make electricity. They're going to light water reactors. And they decided they really did want nuclear electricity. And see, Jeffrey Lewis isn't here, but he wrote a very nice piece for a book that both he and I contributed chapters to on the fact that North Koreans really were serious about nuclear electricity, about a civilian program. And they were. However, light water reactors were a bit beyond what they could manage. First of all, you have to enrich the uranium for fuel. In the gas graphite reactors, you can use natural uranium. It's another reason why they could go that way without telling anybody, in essence. So for light water reactors, that's when they asked the Russians, the Soviets. And so the Soviets said, okay, we'll build you light water reactors, but not unless you join the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that was a condition. And the North Koreans then said, okay, so we'll go ahead and build you these light water reactors, By that time, this was like 1985, so going into 1986. And of course, the Soviets never got there because Soviet Union failed to exist. They couldn't take care of things in their own country, financially. So the Soviets never got there. But that's the piece that got their interest, in light water reactors. They realized by that time, if they're really going to do serious nuclear electricity, got to go to light water. For light water, you have to do the enrichment, and also it's very different technology. So when the agreed framework came along, where the United States had agreed that it would provide 2 light water reactors, big ones, 1,000 megawatt, although they'd have the work with the Koreans and the Japanese, and those 2 countries would bear most of the cost. Because there were people in the United States that were still not going to give the North Koreans anything, regardless. So that was the story on the civilian end. On the weapons end, from a standpoint of nuclear related to Russia. So I've worked, as Sarah knows, I worked very closely with the Russians, sort of as the Soviet Union was coming apart, and then afterwards. So I've been in their nuclear facilities, their Los Alamos, their Lawrence Livermore, their Sandia. I've been in the nuclear factories like out in Seversk, what we call Tomsk 7. I've worked with all those people. I've had most of those people at Los Alamos at one time or another. I think I know them well enough that when they said, "Oh, no, North Korea, they can't build nuclear weapons, for heaven's sakes, we don't have to worry about them. That's what the nuclear weapons people do." There's, as far as I know, and I believe, there's been no cooperation between the Soviets and or the Russians post-Soviet time with the North Korean nuclear weapons program at all. Now, the missile story is a different story. And again, I'll just try to give you a snapshot of that. So in the missile times, there was Soviet-North Korean cooperation, although the big jump in North Korean missile capabilities, the Scuds, initially, North Koreans actually got that from Egypt. The Egyptians got them from the Soviets. Egyptians, by the way, the Egyptians have had very close relationship with the North Koreans, including that big skyscraping 105-story hotel or whatever it is that they have. But then after that, there was direct Soviet-Russia cooperation for the Scuds, the Nodongs. Then after that, during Soviet times. Then comes Russia times, and so the question that we're less sure about, although there are quite a few missile experts in this country and also in a couple of other countries, that will tell you that the Russian government missile cooperation continued, and then sort of more private cooperation between either missile institutes, both in Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine had very good missile capabilities with North Koreans. And actually, there's several defectors from North Koreans who also attest to that. They actually say, "Hey, look, we stayed in the hotel and they were putting up 200 Russian nuclear scientists," they said. When I said, wait, what kind of nuclear are they? They said, well, they might have been missiles, and it looks like they were indeed, they were missile engineers. And then even into, the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's still a lot of talk about certain engines for the missiles, coming from Russia. So the missile cooperation appears to have continued, and there was no nuclear cooperation. Okay, that's a long answer on Russia.
Yeah. What about China, though, Sig? I mean, let's see if, and first of all, if anyone has questions, please, you guys really raise your hand. Bill, you okay? And then we'll go to Abner.
Sig, I think it was a brilliant exposition, and the only additional point that I would raise, and it may lead to a discussion on some of but a different point here, is that I think we have to be careful when we're talking about Soviet policy and the transition, the Russian policy in the nuclear export sphere to a kind of black box process, because my understanding, and it's been a while since I really focused on this, was that during most of the Soviet period, at least until around 1996, 97, the decision-making process within
86.
1986 to
Right.
87, that general period after, after
Gorbachev came.
that the decisions within the Soviet Union with respect to nuclear export policy were really governed by the foreign ministry and the defense ministry. The equivalent of Rosatom at that time was not a consequential player. And the security ministry, I mean, the defense and foreign ministry were committed to non-proliferation. It wasn't a question. And so the decisions were always taken with an eye to preventing anything that might lead to a, not just with North Korea, but more generally to a nuclear, a military nuclear program. That changed, began to change in the last half of the 1980s. And you could see this perhaps less clearly with respect to North Korea, but you could see it in terms of trade with South Korea. You could see it with respect to trade to other countries where they became much looser in their approach. It was kind of the reverse Midas touch. All alternatives to gold we touch tended to begin to dictate policy. So I just think it's important to try, if possible, to understand the bureaucratic and organizational politics and the evolution of those processes in the Soviet Union and the Russian context. So the question that might follow from that is it possible to discern anything comparable on the North Korean side? Because you can talk about the generals, the military, you can talk about the scientists and those who, I know nothing about North Korean nuclear decision making. I'm not sure that people have a very good understanding of the bureaucratic dimension there, to see whether there was also, different factions, if you will, organizational interests that impacted upon the policies of the country writ large.
Mhm. So I would guess in most likelihood, yes, but I didn't have full spectrum of access, to the entire North Korean, from the nuclear to the military side. And so, for example, on the military side, we would certainly meet with some of the generals, but these were almost all pro forma meetings. And so I would say in the military meetings that we had, we essentially learned nothing. Oh, the one thing that I learned, I guess, I was there with John Lewis and Bob Carlin 2 weeks after their first nuclear test. And they, paraded us into one big time general's office. And the one thing that I clearly understood, he knew nothing about anything nuclear or command control or anything about nuclear weapons themselves. So I didn't have access to the military, but I had access to the nuclear complex. And there certainly things changed pretty dramatically as the Soviet Union was heading downhill. And then as it fell apart from their interaction with the people in Yongbyon, and particularly what was the main issue there is I mentioned that the Soviets supplied the IRT-2000 reactor, and the North Koreans worked with that reactor and actually did some redesign and changed the fuel, again, with help, eventually got the fuel from the Soviets, but essentially in late Soviet time, and then as Soviet fell apart, they got no more fuel for that research reactor. And that had an enormous impact on the North Koreans. For example, they used that research reactor to make medical isotopes. And their director told me, look, we need iodine 131. What do you need iodine 131? It's for a treatment of cancer. And the reason for the cancer is, part of their complex was pretty much contaminated. And they were not able to make any more. And so they were quite upset with that. So that relationship really deteriorated strongly. But I can't say anything about the military side and the missile side at all.
It's interesting. Avner, you had your hand up.
Yeah. It's very intriguing, Sig, and I also like to think about countries in terms of what you call hinge, or I call milestones of decision making, where it's unfolded. And I'm struck in the North Korean case, which I don't know in great details, of course, why the country, which essentially with relatively low scientific base, industrial base, decide to put a great deal of its general fate in terms of its relation with the world on the nuclear issue. And I thought to myself, and then you raised it yourself too, so I will bring it back, the questions of Egypt, to compare it with Egypt. Similar population, in some respects, similar base, limited both cases. They got similar assistance from the Soviet Union.
I'm sorry, what was I missed, which country?
Egypt.
Oh, Egypt, yes.
Yeah, that's because you mentioned about the Scud and all that.
Yeah.
So they were in a similar, somewhat starting point. And they got in the 60s similar small reactor from Russia, the Russian atom for peace. With Egypt, ultimately it led to nothing. Egypt never had a true nuclear weapons program. I mean, there was some small probes, but it never led to a program. In the case of North Korea, and it was later on, I mean, Egypt had the 67 war, I mean, and there were, and yet how was it that a country like North Korea, sometimes in the 80s and the 90s, decided strategically, or maybe it was circumstances by small decision, and it came to that point, that would be the major leverage of its relationship with the world, in particular the United States. How come that they chose, somewhat like Iran, that the nuclear issue will put them in the place and will give them a sense of pride, a sense of importance, a sense of prominence, and a way to negotiate? It's a little puzzle because you don't expect country with low industrial and scientific base to do that.
Yeah, no, so that's very good. I don't have a good answer, particularly with respect to Egypt. I mean, the most immediate thing that occurs to me, so the nuclear weapons and the development of the nuclear weapons, and particularly, and again, as I sort of track in the book, I mean, early on when I was there in 2004, they probably had a bomb or two by that time, but they didn't have much, for heaven's sakes. I mean, this was really primitive. So, there was no way that would actually threaten the United States. But by developing the weapon, they would have something to trade in. As I just said, what they wanted from the United States was sort of the strategic accommodation, a normalization. So if they developed a nuclear weapon, that is the piece they could actually trade in for this normalization, for a way that they could bring their country, take care of the external security environment in such a way that they could focus internally. That still, of course, would be an enormous job for them internally, how they compete with the South Korea, with their sort of Soviet-like communist system. That's still a really long shot, but that's the biggest difference that I could see. Who could Egypt, you know much more about that region than I do. Who was there to worry about trading in the nuclear weapons? What good would that have done Egypt? In terms of technical comparison, I just don't know enough about the Egyptian capabilities. I mean, what the North Koreans showed is that you can build a nuclear weapon program without having a world-class scientific capability. Because my view is that's not what the North Koreans have. The Russians, heavens, yes. The Chinese, yes, they have world-class scientific capability, not the North Koreans. What the North Koreans had was really good engineers.
Hmm.
And with those good engineers, they were able to do what had to be done, to make nuclear weapons. And again, I don't know what the Egyptian
So,
capability.
Sig, if I can follow what you said to try to translate it into my question, it seems like you're saying that it wasn't early strategic decision to put their faith on the nuclear issue and to use it, but rather they kind of discovered that from relatively modest things in the early 2000s, the fact you said there are about two weapons, or at least, weapons grade for two weapons, it's give them a certain kind of, the world is interested in that, and it give them a certain kind of leverage, and they realized why not to use it. So it was not early decision, but they rather discover that that's give them importance, that the world takes them seriously, and maybe it's good to continue that way. Is it fair to-
Absolutely. And tracked all the way through. So if you just looked at their interchange with me, which I've written down in the book, they're telling me, in 2004, I'm there, they showed me the Yongbyon facilities. I wound up, for those of you who haven't heard this story, most CNS people have, I wound up holding their plutonium in my hand, in a glass jar. It was all of this to try to show me just how much they have, and what they actually had was damn little. And what they're doing now, of course, they have much, much, much greater capabilities, but they're still firing off these missiles left and right to impress sort of the heck out of us, while they're not fixing this plutonium problem. But it turns out they still have a deterrent because they have enough, even though they have less than 50 kilograms or so of plutonium. Our guess is, our best estimate, they might by now maybe have 1,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, with which you can make 50 or so uranium bombs. And they have the ability, in my opinion, to deliver those anywhere in South Korea and to most of Japan. And that, for the United States, is sufficient deterrent to take them seriously. But along the way, and again, I show as to how we go back. In 2005, there's Vice Minister Kim Gye-gwan is there wanting a light water reactor. And I'm trying to tell them, no, you don't really need a light water reactor. Look, we can help you with conventional energy. You can do all that. No, we want a light water reactor. And you can see how they took those steps along the way. So anyway, that's my response.
Well, that's great, actually, Sig, because it brings me to a question that I am very curious to get your opinion on. So in the book, you talk about this kind of 7-year period of time where you were visiting North Korea, you held the plutonium in your hands, et cetera. And you talk about the fact that you didn't get a lot of kind of political posturing from the North Koreans because they knew that you were a person who understood the significance of what they were showing you. But then that stopped. The nuclear facilities were no longer open to outsiders, so you were no longer able to go. And now you talk about the way in which North Korea is using, as you put it, other means to lift the curtain to its nuclear progress, including things we've talked about here, missile launches, seismic signals that come from a nuclear test, photographs and videos. So to build upon sort of Abner's question about, as I interpret it, were nuclear weapons for North Korea being used as a bargaining chip, why do you think that they changed the way that they are displaying the bargaining chip in this way? And wouldn't it still be useful for them to have a technical person like yourself to come in and say, oh, this is significant? I don't really understand why that shift occurred, and I'm curious, what you think.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the bargaining chip, it wasn't that they developed the nuclear weapons just for that
Right,
purpose.
right.
Again, it was this dual track purpose.
Yeah.
They will come in handy in case the Americans really don't want to do diplomacy. We're going to have nuclear weapons, for heaven's sakes. But it took a long, time to develop that. So, right, one of the big questions, and you just asked, so why did they stop inviting me?
Yeah.
It isn't that I didn't ask to come in.
Yeah.
So actually, when we left in 2010, John Lewis and I were fully expecting, Bob Cullen, we're fully expecting to be able to go back because, that one was remarkable. The 2010 visit is instead of holding the plutonium in my hand, they showed us 2,000 modern centrifuges, which was just mind-boggling. So now they had the second path to the bomb. And then from there, so the best way I can figure it, they just didn't need me anymore. So during those 7 years, the things that they showed me would have been very difficult to get across
Mhm.
in a way to the American government and the international community to actually impress people.
Mhm.
Here they had a nuclear guy, in 2004, he holds the plutonium and he comes back. I mean, I was very conservative, I was very careful of all of that, but the bottom line was what I told my government. Look, if they can make that piece of plutonium, they can make the bomb. That was the bottom line. And that's exactly what they wanted me to say.
Mhm.
But I said it because it was true. Right?
Mhm.
And then in 2010, when they showed me the centrifuge, I came back, I met with Secretary Hillary Clinton. And I said, I mean, they now have the second path to the bomb, and you'll never know how many of these centrifuges they have because they're not like reactors. They don't have big signals. And so now that they got that message across, we have both paths to the bomb. They didn't need me anymore because now what they could do, and they did, they had either Kim Jong-il still until he died in late 2011 and Kim Jong-un go to factories, actually go to wherever they had these models that Jeffrey Lewis, called the disco ball, the first one, the round one, and then the other one later on. They would KCNA, the Central News Agency, would show you these photos with Kim Jong-un discussing that with the director, guy who used to be director of Yongbyon facility, and then later on was called the director of Nuclear Weapons Institute. So they showed you pieces, and then they would do the missiles. And the missile launches, are big time PR things. I mean, you see those going up. And then in the bottom line of nuclear weaponization is a nuclear test. So we don't know exactly what they tested, but in the end, we look at the test, we estimate a yield, and the first one didn't work so well. And as I've said here before and in other places, the other 5, worked just fine. And the last one so far, number 6, was big enough. It was most likely a hydrogen bomb. Now, whether we know how much tritium they have or what else they have, they went boom. They make actually the side of Mount Montauk slid down, considerably. So we know these guys can make the bomb. They tested 6 of them. They've got these missiles, and even though they haven't launched them in a normal trajectory that could reach the United States, but you can do the calculations. They do them aloft, so they have missiles that have the potential of reaching the United States. They have missiles certainly they can reach all of South Korea and Japan. We know they have nuclear devices that can make a big yield. You put all of that together, and so what they have today obviously is much more impressive, and they don't need me as much anymore, as to what's going on in Yongbyon or other places. But this is what I try to bring out in the book. And this is what somehow in my government and a good part of even our analytical community doesn't either understand or certainly does not believe. When we had the chances to go back into Yongbyon, the first time, that was in 2012 with this Leap Day deal. And then the second time at Hanoi, that was our chance to go in and actually see, why don't they have this experimental light water reactor, which they were building in 2010, and they told me it was going to be complete in 2012 at the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth. And I laughed and I said, no, that can't be. This thing is it's a hole in the ground, some concrete coming out. And here we are 12 years later, and it's still not working. So why is it not working? That reactor was primarily for electricity production, but you can repurpose it to make plutonium and tritium. Okay, I want to know, why is it not working? Well, if you get back in, you find out why it's not working. the centrifuges, they rushed me through the centrifuge facility. I asked as many questions as I could. I then made an analysis of how much highly enriched uranium they can make with those kind of centrifuges, realizing that they have other facilities altogether. But my estimate could be off by a factor of 4 if they use different centrifuges. We could have found out because we could have gotten into them. And they didn't, and the Americans didn't want to. They didn't want to go far enough to learn those things because politically it was more important to show these guys that, by God, you can't keep lying and cheating on us. That's, and again, that unless you read the book and you see me, I mean, you must see my tears in there somewhere and say, why didn't you do this?
Oh my God.
Just a
Robert, please.
kind of a quick question maybe on that point is, and you just based in particular on your research into the diplomatic history and the early diplomatic history of those early 1990s engagements, formal, informal, between sort of the U.S. and North Korea, be it track 1.5 or track 1. I was just curious to what extent did you sort of get a sense that the U.S. side was convinced, based on what had happened in Eastern Europe in 1989 and based on what had happened in the Soviet Union in 1991, that North Korea was just simply a matter of time before North Korea was going to collapse. And then when you began to see reports of starvation, food shortages and so forth in 94, I just wondered to what extent that line of thinking was influencing sort of the US position here, is that this is a country that's clearly on the verge of collapse. We can probably just wait and they'll collapse. And I wonder even to what extent that might still be even playing out today, given the weakness of the North Korean economy. But I was just curious what your thoughts were on that particular sort of possible line of thinking that might be influencing sort of the U.S. perceptions on this.
In the 1990s, absolutely, you're absolutely correct. There were many people, and again, actually in both sides of the aisle, even those people who helped to put together the agreed framework, some of them also thought that, look, in the end, it's not going to matter. They're going to fall apart. And so at least we're putting this off for some time before they can, they'll get enough plutonium, but they're going to collapse anyway. And so that was a very strong thread that ran through both the government and the sort of analytic community. How much of that's there today? I mean, you got to say that was 30 years ago, and they're still standing. Grandfather, father, and grandson later. And the economy, this is actually something that Bob Carlin has spent a lot of time on. And what's so interesting about that is just how much the North Koreans have tried to do something about their economy. And in the end, they always wind up just not getting there. But the economy has clearly been, near the top of what they've been concerned about. So I don't know how much people think today they're going to collapse. I think that's much less so today than it was. But in the 90s, it was prevalent.
That's interesting. Why don't you ask your question? And it's maybe you can introduce yourself to Sig also. Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Carl, and thank you for the lecture. Actually, Adeline and I will be going to Japan soon on the INFE with Texas A&M University.
Oh, you're the two. Oh, terrific. So I made that happen.
Good for you,
That's great.
I had a question about, and alluded to your previous answer or response about some of these differences in not just diplomatic efforts and goals, but it also seems like there's a very strong sense of underlying just cultural differences in how to engage in diplomacy, which have hampered this process along the way. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, specifically because I know the U.S., even in relation to some of our East Asian allies, right, we've come up against a sort of these cultural differences, like a sort of opacity in diplomacy, which is kind of hard to break through and get our sort of achieve our goals through. But also more generally, and without wanting to spoil the books, I'm very much looking forward to it. What do you think are the most salient lessons learned that the U.S. can take from this case going forward, with perhaps other similar cases or other cases happening right now unfolding in front of our eyes? And thank you again.
Okay, so in terms of the cultural aspects, you're of course absolutely correct. I mean, that's really critical to understand, and that's why you need to do these things with people who understand the other cultures. For example, with Russia, I think over the years I acquired a lot of that understanding, and the reason for that is with the Russians. Unlike the North Koreans, getting to the question that you asked about the human dimensions, I mean, I met very few ordinary North Koreans. Okay, I've met a lot of ordinary Russians over the years. I've had dinners in Russian homes. I mean, I've just had enormous interaction with the Russians. And also, I grew up in Austria. And so that gave me some feeling, although I must say, by the time I left Austria when I was 13, I still had no use for the Russians. In the end, it turns out I lost my father. He was trying to retreat from Russia in 1945. He was in the German military because after the Anschluss, the annexation, of Austria in 1938. So I had no use for the Russians as such, but I understood a lot about European cultures and so forth. So with Russia, I felt pretty comfortable. Okay, with Korea, I never did because I just don't know enough about the Korean culture. Again, I pick things up. Of course, I picked a lot more up now from the South Koreans because I've been to South Korea more times now than 7, and I've learned a lot. But I still I consider myself a novice. So that's why I dealt with people like a John Lewis, a Bob Carlin. Bob Carlin has been doing North Korea since 1974, the first few decades in the CIA, but he learned a lot.
See, we should just mention Bob Carlin is another non-resident kind of scholar with us who's been here and will be coming back. So just if people are not familiar with the name, to kind of lead them to
I
consider.
should have explained that. So Bob really understands North Korea much better. And so then part of the answer to your question is, so Bob and John Lewis, they wrote a pamphlet essentially on how to negotiate with North Koreans. And so that demonstrates their understanding. And Bob has been through there, for several decades worth of these. He was very much involved in the Agreed Framework as a backup guy, then with the Keto Project. And so he really knows a lot about North Korea. And they put all of those together to say, hey, look, here's sort of how we've watched the North Koreans negotiate. Unless you understand that, you're not going to get anywhere. And then again, the problem is a lot of our administrations didn't use that expertise. So that was a pity. In terms of lessons learned, so that's one of them. The Bob Collins sort of lesson as to how do you negotiate in a different country with different cultures. The book, The Strategic Empathy Arena, that's really important because at least what since I'm a naturalized citizen, I'm not an American born. I come from other countries, different cultures. I like to think that I sort of have a little bit better understanding that you have to appreciate those other cultures and have this strategic empathy, sort of walking a mile in their shoes rather than just your shoes. And again, in the United States, I mean, we just as a country seem to have a way of demonizing countries. So you demonize the whole country. So when I give talks about North Korea, I usually wind up showing at the end, the 1,000 photographs that I've taken of little kids, playing on the 12-string zither, or doing physics experiments in school. And what I say is look, we tend to demonize their leadership, and they're easy to demonize,
Mhm.
but don't demonize the people. So that's a lesson, the strategic empathy. Don't demonize. And then on the technical side is this, we've already said it several times, is the issue of technically informed decisions. That is really critical. And in the nuclear, again, we have a lot of folks in the United States, from a nuclear standpoint, they want the risk to be zero. Well, in the nuclear has such enormous potential positive that if all you do is continue to focus on the negative, you don't get the right answer. And so the fact that North Koreans were, in the Bush administration, they were not allowed to have anything nuclear. You can't trust these people with anything nuclear. I was there with Secretary Condi Rice in 2005, trying to explain, hey, it's okay. And I came back and I showed her in a view graph format as a handout chart. So here is what the director of the Yongbyon facility and I created, his column, my column, as to what the different dangers are of doing nuclear things. And the bottom line is actually the North Korean director, he essentially thought the gas graphite reactors, if you run those, their normal cycle, that plutonium isn't any good to make a bomb. And I said, well, I still have people at Los Alamos that might be able to make a bomb with some of that stuff. So it has some danger. We compared all those. I came back and I showed it to her. In the end, Bob Joseph, who was working for her, felt that there's just no way. And I have it in the book. Bob Joseph told the South Korean, they can have essentially LWRs when pigs fly. And so those are the things that you have to learn.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Carl. I'm going to go to Jean, and then Caitlin, is there someone online who has a question? Perfect. So
Thank
Jean.
you. Thank you, Siegfried. Congratulations on the book. Actually, my question was partly prompted by Robert's comment about waiting for the North Korean regime to act. I recall, well, you probably know exactly what we're talking about, a similar gathering here in about 2003, where a former senior U.S. official made a point that we should just wait for the collapse and the problem will disappear. But my real question is, and I'm sure you addressed it in the book, is which hinge points were there after the collapse of the agreed framework where it was possible to reverse the program? And are there still such potential? And the second question is more related to what you just mentioned about the empathy and understanding of North Koreans. And I remember we also used to have a colleague here that was an expert on North Korean culture and always said that what's published in US newspapers was not necessarily what is meant. So the question is, you mentioned that you just mentioned discussion with Condoleezza Rice, you mentioned your discussion with Hillary Clinton. During the Trump years and even now, are you still kind of being consulted, given your unique, both political as well as technical insights into the North Korean program?
Okay, so as you said, I've already indicated, that back during Bush and during the Obama administration, so I talked to the Secretary of State in both cases, Condi Rice and then Hillary Clinton. And in all of those cases, I both sort of gave him my analysis of what's there and then some suggestions. And so, for example, in 2005 with Secretary Rice, it was, hey, it's worthwhile. Why don't you agree to the light water reactor? It turns out it's so interesting. So I knew Condi Rice through John Lewis. She was a postdoc at CSAC, once upon a time. And so it turns out that actually, I asked her later on whether that had any impact, and she said, yes, it did, because it allowed me, within sort of the sphere of other people's influence, that on the September 19, 2005 six-party agreement actually said that, and we will consider a light water reactor at the appropriate time. So they actually put that in the agreement, which allowed that agreement then to be actually drawn out. The problem was, and I showed this in the book, is the other part of the Bush administration made sure to get back to Ambassador Chris Hill at the time, and he had to issue a unilateral American statement, which basically said, when hell freezes over, you're going to get this. And so that unilateral statement just walked it back. So I had an impact on Condi Rice, and then it fell apart before it could do any good. With Secretary Clinton, I came back because of the highly enriched uranium issue, as I said, and that's when I proposed this 3 no's. I said, hey, look, they sort of got us over the barrel right now. They can still make plutonium. They can now make this highly enriched uranium. We've got a pretty bad situation. Let's make sure it doesn't get worse. So what we coined as the 3 no's were no more bombs, so shut down plutonium, etc. Okay, no better bombs, no nuclear testing, and no export, because we're still worried at that time, is this stuff going to flow out, and I thought she actually sort of liked that idea. I mean, we had great interactions, but in the end, this thing that we call strategic patience, and then actually in the book, I go from strategic patience to what I saw was benign neglect. It just wasn't there. So in the Trump administration, so I actually had, and I mentioned it in here, although I didn't give the colorful version of that. So a couple of colleagues of mine and I met with Secretary Pompeo, and he's got his book out that says, never give an inch. And that was pretty much the bottom line of that discussion that I can fill you in on privately. But I do mention enough that essentially there was no way that Pompeo was prepared to do anything with the North Koreans. So what Bob Carl and I did is we worked with Steve Biegun, who was the special envoy. And it turns out he's an exceptional diplomat. And he actually put together a strategy that could have worked. And to a large extent, it was sort of things that we, drew out also, as well as other people, to say, look, you're not going to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. And by the way, at any of those hinge points, I've sort of said, none of them, if they had done what I would suggest, would mean that they would have gotten rid of their nuclear weapons right then and there. It just would have taken you on a more hopeful trajectory. In the end, there's still lots of things that could have affected that. So with Steve Biegun, we laid out the idea that what we should do is to halt first, roll back, see they actually turn things back around, and then eventually eliminate. Because in the end, and I disagree with some colleagues here at CNS and others about whether you should just say, okay, look, you're a nuclear weapons state. In the end, my view is we have to go to a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. But you have to realize, and that's where we agree a lot, is that's going to take a long time to get there. So what the Trump administration, the really interesting thing is that Trump up here as president had some of the right sense that you got to talk to Kim. And then Steve Biegun down here was this very capable diplomat who could actually put the pieces together to make it happen. The problem is, in between the two of them were the Secretary of State Pompeo and John Bolton, once again. And Bolton, in his book, he makes it very clear. I mean, he was determined that Trump should walk away, and he coached Trump how to walk away from Hanoi. So that was the problem. Yeah, we worked with Began. We gave the input to the government. But in the end, Bolton won and not Began. Now, in the Biden administration, based on all the lessons that I just mentioned to you, I know several people in the administration. I send them advice, for analysis and advice very early on, even before they got into office, but after they were already chosen. And the first thing was, whatever you do, do it fast. Don't spend a long time, doing policy reviews, etc. You have to take some actions. You got to do it pretty fast because the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un is terribly upset by what happened in Hanoi. You have to try some different things. And here's sort of what we've learned. That got nowhere. I can say, I met with Secretary Blinken. He asked a few of us to meet with him. Excellent meeting, great discussion, and nothing afterwards. And essentially the word that we get back is, they're not answering the phone. And indeed they're not, because the thing I didn't say yet, which we said here in a seminar we had where Bob Carlin, Jeffrey Lewis, and I all spoke, is that it appears as we've gone into February a year ago of 2022 that we may have this next pattern change of, as I just mentioned briefly, where the North Koreans have now, and Kim Jong-un has said, maybe we don't need strategic accommodations.
Thank you.
I still haven't answered the China question.
I know, no, that's okay. We can get back to it if we have time too. Caitlin, did the person write the question or do they want to unmute?
So Hannah Harris.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hey, Hannah, we can hear you perfectly.
Fantastic. Great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. And hi, Dr. Hecker. It's great to see you again. I have two questions. So the first one was based on something you mentioned when responding to Carl's question, and that was about how you had more contact with South Koreans later in your career. And I was wondering throughout your work if you've gotten an impression of how North and South relations have kind of changed over the years. It's my understanding from some of the South Korean engineers and scientists that I've met that the 90s was also a huge turning point for North and South relations, and that the agreed framework brought about some hope that projects like KEDO, like the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, there was hope that the North and South could cooperate more. And my understanding was that there were some technical difficulties and there were some estimates that were just very wrong about how much energy capacity North Korea's grid had, but there were also diplomatic failures. So I was wondering if you had if you learned anything about that or had any impression of how kind of the North and South could move forward. And kind of tacked onto that, you've talked about the importance of technically informed decisions. And I wanted to ask kind of maybe a stereotypical student question, but since a lot of us are students and we're studying nuclear history and diplomatic history, are there any moments from the past or any case studies that were either technically informed decision successes or maybe failures that you think students should really understand and look into? Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Hannah. Those are great questions.
Wow. Right. So let me take the last one first. So good examples of where technically informed decisions were made that did the world a lot of good was in the lab program, when we, the Americans, worked with the Russian nuclear scientists. And we did things that, of course, today they seem totally unreal. But back in those days, when we talked about, so we said, look, can we talk about nuclear weapons safety? So how do you do that in a way without giving away nuclear secrets, to get into those details? And so the government, for example, was pretty concerned about that. And yet, through our discussions with the government, with the political people, we were able to convince the people in the Clinton administration that it really makes sense not to change. We can't exchange secrets, but we can get to the point, we do the analysis whether this type of discussion could actually be done. And again, back in the old Soviet days, absolutely impossible. some of the people who made the North Korean decisions would have said, don't go there. I mean, we can't trust those ex-Soviet, now Russian. Instead, we were able to do that. And so if you look at the Doomed to Cooperate book, there is particularly this one thing that I now mentioned, which is just this great example. There was something called PDD 47, Presidential Decision Directive 47, that Bill Clinton signed in 1996, that gave us additional ability to talk about these very sensitive things with the Russians. And it was a technically informed, very good decision. And we had multiples like that at that time when it came to nuclear material security, lots of other, and on their side also the Russians. Or another technically informed decision is I had the head of Tomsk 7. It's an outfit they called it Seversk also, that made plutonium, tritium, everything else that you can imagine. I had him at Los Alamos. I brought him into our TA-55 plutonium facility. A technically informed decision was it's okay to bring him in because the benefit that he gets is to find out just how hard it is to get into these facilities. He couldn't believe when I had to show my badge to the guard. He says, doesn't he know who you are? And I said, oh yeah, he knows who I am, but our rules say you have to show your badge to get in. We get them through TA-55. We put drapes over some of the glove boxes of the things they shouldn't see. We were able to do that because it was important to get the benefits of them walking through. Those are, and there are just many, many others. So that whole program was a series of these sort of decisions where the government could have cut us off and they didn't. They allowed us to do it. And the bottom line is there were no loose nukes. There were no loose materials in essence. There are not many loose people, not much in terms of loose export. So it worked. So that's that one. Let's see the other, the South Korean North, the North-South relationship just continues to puzzle me. I mean, I am just baffled. So I guess I don't understand the culture as well. There are photos from the Moon presidency. When they were up, Kim Jong-un and President Moon were up on top of Mount Pektu, the holy, and they were holding hands up there together. I mean, it was just unreal. I talked to people who were with President Moon at the Pyongyang summit. And they really believed that they had a relationship, a beneficial relationship that's going to allow them to get eventually to a point where you get rid of the nuclear weapons and perhaps even do something about how you do some integration, if not unification. And then you go back a lot like the Americans. You go back to a different government, a totally different system. So you have President Yoon coming in. I've just written a piece on one of his comments, which was, maybe we're going to be forced to build our own nuclear weapons. And I said, well, that's the dumbest idea that I can think of. It's going to make the Korean Peninsula and South Korea less safe, and it's going to cost the people more than they would ever want to put up. And so, but that relationship has fluctuated up and down for years. I just really don't understand it.
Thank you, Sig. Hannah, maybe a project for you. Yeah, to
Right.
investigate.
It would be. I still want to do the China question.
Yeah, okay, so I was gonna ask you, Sig, so let's talk about China, and then the other things I was hoping to touch on, we've got about 10 minutes, are potentially nuclear exports. So I don't know if there's a way to kind of tie those things in. And then the last one I am curious about is this idea of how you understand that you are in a hinge point as it is unfolding. Because it strikes me that one of the recommendations in the book is really, looking retrospectively, there are these moments where people should have anticipated that they were at a fork in the road. How can policymakers do that effectively when they're not sure what the two forks are, or they don't recognize that they're at that fork? So however you'd like to take this.
Okay, the last one, I think I'll
Sure.
make the quickest.
Okay.
That's really tough.
Yeah.
Because you just, it's like falling off a cliff, but you're walking along and you don't see where the cliff is. But that, that's what the diplomats do. That's what the government's supposed to do. They're supposed to constantly keep track of how things are changing. And they have all kinds of analysts, not only CIA, but lots of other places. And I would say probably the other thing from what I've learned in my years with North Korea, more so than with the other countries, is pay attention to the track 2, track 1.5 people. Is what really, if you look at what's happened in relation to North Korea, we had a legion of American people who had enormous access to the North Koreans. John Lewis is one of those. But there are several former ambassadors. There's Don Gregg, for example, is another one. Oberdorfer, who with Bob Carlin did an update of his book. He's no longer with us. Kathy Stevens, was an ambassador. I just saw her this past week. Those people had terrific access. The North Koreans would come to the United States to talk to them. They would go to North Korea. They'd meet in Geneva. They'd meet, in Sweden. That's where you get the sort of information and the early warning of what's going on. And so you have to have your early warning signals out, and you do that by having as much interaction and contact as you possibly can. And that's exactly why today is such a dangerous situation. We have none of that left. None of those people that I just mentioned have any contact. There are few, the other ones, some of the Russians still do. I just spoke to somebody from the UK the other day that had some contact with the North Korean mission in the UK. So do that. Let's see. So to China, just to do it real quickly, and Tong Chao, we can discuss this much more later. But China also has not helped the North Koreans with its nuclear weapons program. China has also done much less for the North Koreans in terms of its own nuclear energy program. There's been very, very little interaction from that standpoint. In the missile program, yes, there's been interaction going back to the 80s or so. And so there was some cooperation, but that's not unexpected, because in the 80s, that was still Soviet China, good relations with North Korea. They had these sort of exchanges. Some of the TELs, transportation for the missiles also, from what Jeffrey Lewis and others, been able to say, it looks like they had Chinese origin. But none of that puts China in the context of saying they've helped North Korea with the nuclear weapons program. That's not there. Actually, the very positive aspect of this, and I described just a little bit of that in the book, nowhere near what it deserves, and that is my Chinese nuclear counterparts, in other words, from their nuclear weapons program, they're keenly interested in the North Korean nuclear program, and they're keenly interested in talking to me about it because they never had access. And so when each time I went to North Korea, I have to go through Beijing to get there and back, and I would meet with my Chinese nuclear colleagues. And so that we would exchange, I would exchange information of what I saw, what my analysis was. They would exchange information as to how we should look at the North Korean program, that it probably is a lot more like theirs grew up, rather than how ours grew up and what one can learn. So we compared, for example, when the first nuclear test was done, and as I mentioned, I was in North Korea 2 weeks later and then in China. And at that particular time, they were still trying to sort out exactly how badly did that nuclear test perform. And there were quite a few in the United States that said it was a fizzle. Okay, so in other words, it was really down, much less than a kiloton. There were others by that time said, maybe it was a couple hundred tons, a fraction of a kiloton or so. So I had the discussion with my Chinese colleagues, and it was very simple. They said, I actually asked them first, was it really true that the North Koreans told the Chinese just before the nuclear test that the nuclear test is going to be at such and such a time and that it would be 4 kilotons? And it turns out, even though in China I've gotten several different versions of that, but the people who I really believe said, yes, we were told it was 4 kilotons. And so their analysis of the first nuclear test was, and they also said, by the way, we have the closest seismic station to North Korea. What we calculate is somewhere around a kiloton. So their nuclear expert says, look, they said it was going to be 4 kilotons. It was 1 kiloton, not perfect, but not bad for your first test. So that was the Chinese analysis. And as it turns out now, not 2 weeks later, but many, many years later, that was the best assessment. It looks like it was close to 1 kiloton, so they got nuclear yield. It just didn't work right. And that was the main reason, as I point out in the book, why in 2009 they greeted Obama, with the fist instead of outstretched hand. They really needed to do another nuclear test on their end. So I'm going to leave it there.
That's great, Sig. Does anyone have any final questions? Okay, it looks like we've satisfied everyone's curiosity. I know you're all going to go out and buy the book now so that you can fully appreciate everything Sig has told us. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our speaker.